Futures trading involves risk and is not suitable for all investors. Content provided in this segment is meant for educational purposes and is not a solicitation to buy or sell commodities.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the Grain Feed, brought to you by EverAg. This is your weekly news feed for all things grain and all things feed. Each week we bring you updates on the markets with unique perspectives from an amazing team of analysts with the intention of helping dairy and livestock producers manage your risk. I'm your host, Jim Matthews, reporting from Chi-Town. It's what the kids are calling it. It's Chicago. But joining me today from Texas, Director of Feed Procurement, Mr. Jake Kingsley, and making his first appearance on the Grain Feed from Iowa, Executive Director of the Soy Transportation Coalition, Mr. Mike Steenhoek. Team, how are we today?
We're doing good.
Excellent.
Doing pretty good today, Jim. Thanks.
Very good. Very good. Mike, it is great to have you. You are reporting from Iowa. How are things in Iowa this morning?
Oh, it's going really well. Yeah, the harvest is pretty much done. You don't see a lot of unharvested fields these days, still a few, but the weather's really, really nice. And so we had a little warming going on. So yeah, things are nice. It's sunny. Things are good.
Yeah, we'll take that. I mean, because Mike, I don't know how your Halloween was, but we had snow. It was freezing. Not a great way to wrap up October. So to be approaching mid-November here, we'll take some 50s and sunshine here and there. I think that feels nice. Usually this part of the show, Mike, then I pretend to care about Jake's weather, so we'll just skip it and we just won't ask him.
65 degrees, a light rain, low of 58.
Oh, okay. So parka weather for you.
We're doing
Gotcha.
it.
Yeah,
there you go.
Okay. And then, Mike, before we dive into the show, we'll run through markets real quick, and we got a big WASD report here this morning that we'll be talking about. Would you mind just telling the viewers a minute about yourself and what you do for the coalition?
So yeah, I'm the executive director of an organization called the Soy Transportation Coalition. And it's a farmer-funded, farmer-led entity. And there's a collection of organizations that fund the Soy Transportation Coalition. There's actually 14 state soybean associations. So the Iowa Soybean Association, the Ohio Soybean Council, the North Dakota Soybean Council. So there's 14 of those states that all contribute funding for the organization, and then they will appoint one or two of their own farmer directors to serve on my board of directors. And then we have the two national soybean groups, the United Soybean Board and the American Soybean Association. So farmer-funded, farmer-led. And as the name suggests, we work on transportation and supply chain issues that are of consequence to the industry. And the way I like to tee it up is you've got the farmers growing the crop and you've got demand for it. And much of that demand is halfway around the world, but you have to have a way to connect the two. And that's what our multimodal transportation system does. And if you don't have an effective inventory of rural roads and bridges and highways and interstates, our freight rail system, our inland waterways and our ports, the transaction will never occur. Supply and demand will remain in distant corners. And transportation can either be an obstacle to farmer profitability or it can facilitate farmer profitability. And it just depends on how good it is. And so we really try to focus on what are those opportunities to increase the cost effectiveness, the reliability, and the resiliency of the agricultural supply chain.
Okay. Well, thank you for that, Mike. And thanks for everything that you do for the coalition. And of course, our soybean growers here in the U.S. I know a lot of us, I think myself included, take our transportation and logistics here in this country for granted at times. But when you talk to maybe some of our friends in the Southern Hemisphere or even go down and visit and see what they're working with, I think it become very appreciative of what we have up here, especially in the Midwest, and the work that you do, Mike, for our farmers. So thank you very much. And we're looking forward to hearing a little bit more about what's affecting your world here this morning. But first, got a lot to run through market-wise as well. So Paige, if you would kindly timestamp the broadcast. It is Thursday morning. It's WASD Day. It's a wacky WASD Day here in Chicago, and we've got a big report coming out in about 55 minutes from now. The markets have been on a wild little ride here over the last week or so, and moving into this report today, the corn market clearly thinks that we're going to have a neutral to bearish type of report today because we've got D's corn now pushing 470 once again, trying to reestablish those contract lows, and the March futures back to 485. So again, corn under some pressure before the report this morning. Beans are now back to steady lower moving into this, but beans have mostly been on an uptrend as of late, either on their own accord and or chasing soybean meal, that stubborn little byproduct, which is now under slight pressure, maybe under some profit taking and or repositioning before today's report. But Dees meal still just floating around that $450 per ton level. Stubborn little byproduct. Jake, we'll be checking in with you, I think, on what we anticipate for some yields maybe on this report here this morning. We'll get to you. But first, Mike, if we could turn it back to you and tell us what's on your mind this week in terms of what's affecting our soybean farmers here in the U.S.
Yeah, one of the things that has occupied a lot of attention over the last month and continues to this day is a movie sequel that none of us want to watch, and that is low water conditions on the Mississippi River. And in 2022, we had historically low levels. And the consequences of that were that barge transportation, which is one of the main conduits for soybeans and corn to get down to our export facilities in the Mississippi Gulf onto the international marketplace, was severely restricted. Barge companies have to resort to and respond to low water conditions in really two ways. Number one is out of concern for channel depth. So they have to light load their barges. They can't put as much, in our case, soybeans per barge, out of a concern that it's going to scrape the bottom of the river and maybe even experience a grounding, which that has certainly occurred. And then number two is channel width. And so when you have less water in the system, the shoreline emerges more and more, and the shipping channel becomes more narrow. And so what that means is you can't attach as many barges together to form one single unit that then goes down to the New Orleans area for our export facilities. And so all of a sudden, the economic significance of barge transportation has been severely constricted. And we experienced that last year. And unfortunately, we're seeing the same phenomenon this year due to drought conditions. It's a reminder of the fact that drought not only impedes the ability to grow a crop, it also impedes the ability to transport that crop. And so we're seeing, barge companies having to reduce 25% less that they load per barge, and a similar kind of percentage reduction, 25, 30%, the reduction of the number of barges they can attach together. The good news is that we're still exporting from the Mississippi Gulf region. We're still moving product by barge, but it's not as efficient as it normally is. And frankly, it comes at a very inopportune time, which is our harvest season, and which is also our key export window. So that's clearly a big issue that we're really focusing on. Drought conditions are also impacting another important link in our supply chain, and which is the Panama Canal. The Panama Canal operates by using fresh water to allow the locks to operate. And you have to have a sufficient amount of fresh water in order to allow that transit from the Atlantic and to the Pacific Ocean and back. And because drought conditions manifest there, they're having to limit the number of transits per day. So all of a sudden, you're having more of a wait outside of the Panama Canal. And every year, 600 million bushels of U.S. soybeans utilize the Panama Canal. So it's an important part of our supply chain. So obviously, the issue of drought, it's been a big topic of discussion this year. It's clearly something that we're monitoring this fall.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's definitely a big problem. And like you said, Mike, it's like a bad sequel of this year to year now. We've been talking about these issues. Jake has been speaking to a lot of our dairy farmers across the country, and it's almost hard to digest sometimes about how the drought situation in the Midwest and the lowering of river levels ultimately then impact how you are able to then purchase feed, even when you're on the West Coast, or in the Southeast. I mean, it ultimately does have an impact all across the country. And I think from Jake's standpoint too, we've seen basis levels now have to shift because of the inability to have things move downriver efficiently. So it's definitely another trying time. And it's like you said, Mike, the export window, it's opened, right? We just had another round of big flash sales this morning, Thursday morning, some big boy sales to China and unknown destinations on the soybean front. So the soybean demand remains pretty steady. And then your notes of the Panama Canal itself. That is something I think often overlooked by folks up here because we are focused on our own drought concerns. And folks, if you ever have some time to just YouTube how the Panama Canal works, it's pretty amazing watching those locks perform, because it's quite the task of having a soybean vessel move in from the Gulf down there and make its way ultimately to the Pacific. So very important stuff. Mike, are you seeing anything from the, let's say, rail side or trucking side in terms of, we've been watching energy prices elevate, especially with the Middle East conflict, which began, about a month or so ago. We did see crude oil ultimately run up, back to like $90 a barrel for a hot minute. Things maybe are somewhat contained there for the moment. And we've seen crude oil ultimately pull back. Some other energy prices have come back just a little bit, diesel as well. Are there concerns on your side over how that ultimately impacts other logistics here in the Midwest?
It does. That's anytime you have both the prospect of energy scarcity and availability and cost all get called into question, that's obviously a real concern. The dilemma for U.S. agriculture, similar things happen in Brazil, is that you've got the production areas in the middle of the country, but so much of the demand is halfway around the world. Agricultural production does not occur adjacent to our coastal regions. So that means there needs to be transportation involved to be able to get to those areas. And that involves a lot of fuel. And so that's something that obviously is a real concern for us. Now, related to the other modes of transportation, particularly rail, in the midst of some of these challenges with the Mississippi River, it's kind of not much of a consolation prize, but the railroads are actually saying we do have capacity to absorb some of this cargo diversion away from the river because exports are not very strong and haven't been very strong. Now, we have had, as you mentioned, some recent strong sales announced, particularly to China and then elsewhere around the world. But overall, we've had some real headwinds confronting our exports, currency values being one, interest rates being another. The monster crop that has been produced by Brazil, all of a sudden there's less of a distinct segmentation of when the U.S. export window is and when the Brazilian export window is. There used to be much more of a distinct 6 months on, 6 months off, and now there's much more of an overlap between the two because of the significant production coming out of Brazil. So because of some of those headwinds with our export program, some of these alternative modes of transportation do have some capacity, which again, that's good that there's capacity, but the reason for that is not very favorable. So it's certainly something that we're experiencing right now.
Okay, good deal. Well, thank you very much, Mike. We really appreciate your insights on this. So great to have you here. Jake, we will turn it to you. A lot of the issues that Mike has discussed here today have been impacting the way you are ultimately able to advise folks in terms of how, where, when to procure feed. This has been a big talking point for us. Is there anything else in this conversation you'd like to hit on today? And what else might be impacting our dairymen as we move into this WASDE report here this morning?
Yeah, I think some slow-moving exports and difficulty getting product out of the country has certainly been a benefit to feed buyers at the detriment of the producer. It's a benefit to the feed buyer here. Typically, you see rail rates perk up a little bit this time of year because you do have a scramble to move some product across the country. They're definitely stronger than they are in the rest of the year, but I don't think we're seeing any exaggerated premium being tacked on, like you said, because there's just a lack of an export program for that as well. Fuel prices year over year are down a touch, and so that helps out as well. But then as we look towards WASDE, we do still have protein basis values gathering a little bit of premium here, and that's largely due to concerns around what this WASDE report's going to entail here today. We feel like corn yields have been pretty healthy. That crop's pretty well defined, but maybe we continue to see a decline in soybean yields. There's been a pretty steady program of canola exports out of Western Canada. So we saw those values kind of perk up and respond to South American weather, particularly Argentina on the meal front. Now here recently, weather forecasts in Brazil look less than ideal, and we're seeing that reflected in the soybean futures market. I think there's a lot of premium already built into the market here, kind of anticipating some of the potential changes that we could have in the U.S. balance sheet as well as the global balance sheet. But it looks like the industry is expecting relatively minimal changes on this WASDE report today. The question will be, what does the December and the January report look like when we start to really finalize those numbers, especially now that we're seeing some export sales on the protein side to China here. We're watching it. I think we've got folks well positioned. There was a lot of opportunity early on in the feed year. Now I think we've got to just kind of manage positions and take advantage of breaks for stuff for the back half of the year if we do see South American weather turn back in our favor. So we've got time in our pocket here to kind of work with for some of this stuff, but could be a little bit of an exciting report today.
Yeah, certainly could be, Jake. And Jake, you were very diligent about approaching a lot of the folks that we work with on the dairy and livestock side to say, hey, we kind of felt this protein tightening situation, all the concerns coming out of South America. Like you said, it feels like maybe the Argentine side has now been slightly alleviated, which is great, but also feels like maybe the Brazilian side has worsened. And for feed buyers, maybe not so great, right? Because the northern and central areas of Brazilian crop acreage remain very hot, very dry. Those southern areas far too wet, a lot of flooding out there, maybe some replanting to come from that part of the world. So we are hoping for relief for those buyers, maybe in the second half of their feed year. So let's say maybe April forward. But again, with prices up where they are on the protein front, very difficult to try and step in and take ownership beyond that. But on the corn side, like you mentioned, Jake, if there's not a whole lot of changes today, I'd say that's pretty neutral, if not bearish. We've got a big corn crop here in the U.S. and a big balance sheet. So not a whole lot of upside anxiety on corn, but maybe a good idea to step in for your January forward type of ownership, at least from a hedging perspective, while we have prices and volatility down at these levels. So we'll see what WASDE brings us in about 35 minutes or so. So since we have it, we will do some bold predictions on yield numbers today. We're going to borrow the bold predictions from Phil and Kathleen from the Dairy Download. So Jake, we'll start with you here. Bold prediction. What's the bean yield number going to be on today's report?
I think I'm with the industry. They're going to leave it unchanged. I bet they don't change it again until we get to January.
Okay. So we're at 49.6. This is a follow-up bold prediction. What's that final print going to be?
I wonder if they don't trim it up closer to 49 then, but I'm wondering if they want to see kind of how our export market shapes up over the next month or two before they come in and shock everybody with a 49-ish yield.
Wow. Okay. Jake, dirty talk. Mike, would you mind giving us a bold prediction on what today's soybean yield number is going to be?
I don't have a number, but this is totally anecdotal. But the farmers that I just continue to talk to, the yields have been a pleasant surprise. Given the adverse conditions that we've had throughout the year, we once again see the productivity of farmers, but also the genetics and the technology behind these seeds are continuing to really pay dividends. I think it's going to continue to be a reiteration of the fact that you can have some pretty adverse conditions, but there's a lot of resiliency to our agricultural complex.
There is a lot of resiliency, especially with the two hot and dry spells we had this summer. It feels like things could have and maybe should have been a lot worse. And we saw the markets react that way a couple times this summer with some big runs higher in both the corn and soybean markets. So futures reflecting those concerns, but then ultimately reflecting the ease of maybe knowing, hey, we're not dealing with the same type of technology that we had, 15 plus years ago. And we can withstand a lot more of this. So that's a good point, Mike. I am going to pin Jake on another number here. I want Jake to give a bold prediction on the corn yield number today. Jake, bold prediction.
Man, I've been hearing similar sentiments, better than what you were saying on bean yields as far as resiliency and pleasantly surprised in this corn number. I wonder if they don't bring it up to like 173.5, maybe 174.
Wow.
Maybe.
You're calling for 174 corn yield today?
Maybe.
You don't do maybes in bold predictions, Jake.
Put me at 173.5.
173.5. Where were we October? 173 even?
I think we were flat 173 in October.
Okay. All right. I'm going to take bean yields down to 49.5. That's my bold prediction. And we will take corn yields down to 172.9. Heard it here first, folks. You heard it here first. Team, we'll roll with that because we got to go prep for some WASDE fireworks here in about 30 minutes. So excellent work to you both. A big thanks to Mike for joining this show today. It was great to have you. Extremely insightful. So really appreciate your time here this morning. We would also like to thank Corey and the Everag Insights crew for their support. Thank you to Paige for her production magic. And thank you to the viewers for watching the grain feed. Contact information is on the screen. We greatly appreciate your feedback. That's all for today. We'll see you next time on the grain feed.